It's nice in its own way.
Okay, so 12:04, as I promised, or 04 past the hour. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Please do continue to send in the chat where you're signing in from and any special connection you have to the Emirates. Makes it more interesting. And so, as you can see, all of your microphones and cameras are off at this point. They will remain off until Rabbi Abadie finishes his presentation. At that point, we do encourage you, please turn on your cameras. Microphones only if you have a question, but turn on your cameras. Wave at me if you have a question. Send a question into the chat. I'm happy to read it if you prefer it that way. Send it into the Q&A. I will read it out. But that's really where we are. So thank you all for joining. And I will hand it over at this point to the Executive Director of the American Sephardi Federation, who will say hello and thank you.
Thank you, Drora, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's such a pleasure today to have our good friend, Hacham Rabbi Dr. Elie Abadie, and also Professor Ronnie Perelis, who is the Chair of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University and the ASF's academic representative at the Center for Jewish History. And we're hopeful with this event and with the event tomorrow, which will be in Espanol, to give people an interesting and exciting perspective on the developments going on in the Gulf, of which Rabbi Abadie is intimately involved as the Senior Rabbi of the UAE and now the new chair of the ASF's Council of Sephardic Sages, as well as the Rabbi of the Association of Gulf Jewish Communities. So this has been a multi-year process that we've been working behind the scenes, and now more and more of it is becoming coming into to the public, and we're very excited to have this discussion today. Thank you.
And to be partnering together with the Rabbi Albert Schneer, right? Yes, no?
Arthur
Schneier.
Schneier, yes.
Schneier.
Arthur
Schneier.
Yes.
International Program of Yeshiva University.
Exactly.
So, thank
of
you
which
very much.
Professor Perelis is the head.
And we will hand it over to Professor Perelis, who will do the next introductions.
Thank you so much. Good morning, afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I see we have people from all across many time zones. I'm going to leave some people out, but I just want to acknowledge some people I see that have come to join. The Provost of Yeshiva University, Selma Botman, who, in addition to being a very fabulous leader for our institution, is also a Arabist, a scholar of Egyptian history. So I know she has a personal interest in this topic. I also see Rabbi Albert Gabai, Rabbi Gabai from Philadelphia, and Chacham Elazar Demota, which is really wonderful to see you all here. And I know there are many more people that I'm definitely missing. I am Dr. Ronnie Perelis, the Chief Rabbi, Dr. Isaac Abraham and Yelena Rachel Alkali, Associate Professor of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University, and the Director of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs. I want to welcome you all here today for this special program, Jewish Life in the Arab World, a New Chapter, with Rabbi Chacham Elie Abadie, MD, the Senior Rabbi of the UAE and the founder and president of the ASF's Council of Sephardic Sages. I want to thank all of the institutions and individuals who worked hard to make this possible, both today's event and tomorrow's event in Espanol. Our partners in Latin America, Rabbi Marcos Meta of the Mahon Torah Vedat in Mexico City, Mr. Gaston Maya and Dr. Alberto Levy of the FESELA, the Federación Sephardi Latinoamericana, Jason Guberman, the Executive Director of the American Sephardi Federation, Dr. Drora Rusi of the Institute for Jewish Experience at the American Sephardi Federation, who did so much to make this happen, and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs at Yeshiva University. One of the bright moments of the otherwise difficult year of 2020 came with the signing of the historic Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Peace is precious, and when it is forged between two peoples, it is a cause for celebration. Most of you tuning in today understand that the history of Jews within the Muslim world is rich and complex. There are deep bonds between Jews and Muslims that lead all the way back to the earliest days of Islam. Jews were an integral part of life on the Arabian Peninsula way before the rise of Islam, and as Islam spread across the globe, Jews were an integrated and energizing part of the culture and society that developed in the Dar al-Islam. Jews were active participants in the global network of merchants and the multi-layered international project of translation and reinterpretation of philosophical and scientific works throughout the world. Jews were an integral part of the great cities of the Arab world, from Granada to Fez to Kairouan to Cairo and Damascus and Baghdad and beyond. I believe that the new openness and respect concretized in the Abraham Accords give hope to Jews and Muslims around the world that perhaps we can see a return to the synergy and dynamism that was the hallmark of Jewish-Muslim relations for centuries. Today, we will hear from someone with unique perspective on the promise and perils of this relationship, and who will be able to share with us what it is like to be part of what many of us hope will be a Jewish renaissance on the soil of the Arabian Peninsula, and a new chapter of cooperation, intercultural exchange, and mutual flowering within the wider Arab and Muslim world. Chacham Dr. Elie Abadie was born in Lebanon, lived in Mexico and New York, trained and works as a physician and a rabbi. This is the true hallmark of a Sephardi Chacham, someone who is both part of the world and part of the heritage of Torah. He is now the Senior Rabbi of the UAE and has launched the ASF's Council of Sephardi Sages. And I am so honored and excited. I am so honored and excited to hear from him today. And I want to just say one thing. I really hope that you all can share your questions into the chat, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So please send those questions to the chat. And without any further ado, Chacham Abadie, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Pereles, Drora, Jason. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are in the globe. And I'm honored that Yeshiva University and my alma mater and Fesela, my very dear comrades in arms, so to speak, so Sephardic tradition in South America, are here and are co-sponsoring this. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I have been quoted when I assumed the position almost 8 months ago that I have basically closed the circle of having been born in the Middle East in an Arab country, and now having gone back in a sense to that region, to another Arab country, and in a sense closing the circle. Let me explain myself. My entire life has been in a sense shaped and formed by my experiences in the Middle East and by the experiences of my parents in the Middle East, and of course by studying the history of my ancestors and most of Sephardic Jewry, since they landed in Spain, according to many historians, some of them up to 3,000 years from the time of King Solomon, or later on 2,500 years ago. But be that as it may, let me begin with just a shorter period of time, from 1947 or so. As my parents, descendants of Spanish Jews, Megorashim, the Castilian exile, my ancestors having gone from Spain to Catalonia, Provence, Italy, made the trek through Southern Europe all the way to the Ottoman Empire, and then eventually settling in Aleppo, Syria in the mid to early 1800. My parents were born there and lived there. As beautiful Jewish community in Aleppo was known to be the Jerusalem of that area, if you will. Great sages community for thousands of years that even Maimonides himself praised it for what it was. They lived like in any other Arab country as an autonomous religious community, but of course originally they had paid the dhimmis, the jizya for being Jewish. By then, Arab nationalism was being created. Independence of many of those Arab states was taking place. And at the same time, the partition plan of the United Nations dividing what was known then as the land of Palestine into Israel, into a Jewish home and an Arab home. And at that time, November 29th, 1947, they declared a 2 to 3 days of rage in the entire Arab world, basically, where they rose against the Jewish communities, burned synagogues, looted their stores, entered into their homes, so on and so forth. My parents lived right next door to the Great Synagogue, and they saw themselves how the Arab mob entered into the synagogue, took out Sifrei Torah, Torah scrolls, took out Sidurim, Chumashim, books, religious books, burned them in the patio of the synagogue. They even carried the rabbi out and they dumped him in the street. And then they continued going to Jewish stores and Jewish home. And my parents' home, as I said, was next door. The next home after the synagogue was going to be my parents' home. And as my mother saw them climbing into the fence to climb into their home, immediately my mother told my father, I'm taking my kids. I had 3 siblings then, my oldest ones. She took them, she ran from the back door, never to return to that place. And they escaped to Lebanon, where they found more tranquility. My father went back and forth, again, escaping from Lebanon back to Syria, from Syria back to Lebanon, to make sure that the family was well established. He had businesses in Syria, and he was a rabbi himself. Finally, I'm not going to go through his story, but he was caught the last time and almost lost his life. But miraculously, he survived and was able to make it into Lebanon safely. They lived in Lebanon for 22 years. I was born there in Lebanon. Lebanon at the beginning was under French mandate. Jews lived quietly, tranquilly, but they always knew, unfortunately, it's an Arab country. And at that time, Jews were not that welcome in Arab countries. As we know, almost 1 million Jews were either expelled or persecuted or imprisoned in 10 Arab countries because of the establishment of the State of Israel. And so my parents lived there in Lebanon, as Lebanon was more of a westernized, French influenced country. They lived there until 1971 that we left. And we left for 2 main reasons. We went through the 67 war. I was very, very young, but I do remember the fear that we had. I do remember the propaganda against Israel and the Jews. And we thought that once they destroy Israel, they will come and destroy us as a community. As many of the neighbors were not sympathizers of Israel or the Jews, certainly not. Ultimately, we heard the truth about that war in which Israel won, and we felt a little bit safer. But we knew that Lebanon is not a country that had much future for the Jewish community. And that is because of their very delicate political structure that the French had established, meaning that the presidency had to be to a Catholic Maronite. Prime ministership was supposed to be to a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Parliament had to be a Shiite Muslim. A foreign ministry or an interior ministry was for the Druze, and that's how they divided the government based by religious groups. And always there was a lot of instability in that. Because each group felt they may want it more of that share. And eventually that came to happen. And we knew that it was going to happen. So we were planning to leave, but we couldn't leave because we were refugees. We were refugees when my parents came from Syria, they were considered as refugees. And in Lebanon, the law is if you are refugees, you are forever a refugee. Even your 1,000 generation after, there will still be refugees. They will never receive a Lebanese citizenship. And so we're refugees and we couldn't leave the country because no country will accept us. They will have to accept us as refugees. And any country that would accept you as refugees, basically they have to be financially supporting of you and so on and so forth. So no country wanted to take that responsibility. So we were stuck. So we stayed until after Black September, the infamous or famous war between Arafat, the PLO, and King Hussein of Jordan, in which Arafat wanted to do a coup d'etat against King Hussein. King Hussein, basically, we are told, slaughtered over 20,000 of them, of the PLO, and they were kicked out of Jordan. No Arab country will welcome them. Lebanon was forced by the Arab League to welcome Arafat and his terrorist group, the PLO. And so we started seeing them in the streets with protests, with manifestations, with khaki dress, with weapons. And we knew that Lebanon was going down the drain and the whole society was going to go into war. We tried to speed up our attempt to leave the country to no avail. Not succeeding. And in the meantime, my oldest brother traveled to Mexico. He was basically, my father had 3 sisters and cousins there who asked for him to come. He ended up marrying one of their daughters. And he was our only hope that he could make a family reunification. Excuse me. One day, around 1970, the picture of my father and 2 other rabbis, the Bet Din of Lebanon at that time, appeared on posters, large posters in most of the mosques in Lebanon. And that same picture also appeared in a magazine, like the Paris Match or Time magazine of Lebanon at that time, with a long article stating these are the Zionist agents that are helping Jews escape to Israel and that are supporting Israel. Of course, and this is the picture which I would like to show you, so because it has become a famous picture. My father is the one with the hat. So that picture appeared, as I said, in posters. And you know, when you are in an Arab country that is declared an enemy of Israel, and you have your picture in a major magazine and posters in a mosque saying you are a Zionist agent, basically you have a target on you, and anybody who would kill you, they would do it with impunity. And so, of course, the 3 rabbis hid in their home for like 2 to 3 weeks until the government reassured them that that they will be safe. And my mother sent that article and that picture to Mexico and pleaded with my oldest brother to go to even the president of Mexico if he can, and tell them we are dealing with saving lives. We have here refugees that if they are not allowed to come to Mexico, they will be killed. And that really what sped our exit from Mexico. Finally, in 1971, we left Lebanon and we immigrated into Mexico. And that's where I grew up from age 10 to age 18. It was a beautiful life, I have to say, in Mexico. Teenage, to live a beautiful life in the Jewish community. Nothing that could have been better, actually. Finally, when I decided to study as a doctor, I wanted to be able to keep the Shabbat, keep kashrut, keep everything, the holidays. And it was impossible to become a doctor in Mexico that way because tests, laboratories were all on Saturdays. And those days, there was no exception. Nowadays, they are doing exceptions, but in those days, there were no exceptions. You had to do so. I was not willing to do so. And I suddenly heard of a beautiful institution. Here is a plug to my alma mater, Yeshiva University, a Jewish university and a yeshiva that I could become a doctor without having to compromise my Jewishness, my Jewish upbringing, my religious observance. And so here I go, and I came to the United States to attend Yeshiva University, where I studied and I acquired a lot of knowledge. At the same time, I became a doctor, a physician, a rabbi, have a master's in philosophy. And so that's how I began my life. Although my original intent was to be a physician and maybe give classes in Judaism 1 or 2 or 3 nights a week. somehow destiny or the Almighty had a different plan and made the rabbinate my main profession, so to speak, and medicine my my vocation or my part-time. Although at the beginning I was full-time on both. You know, when people would ask me, are you full-time rabbi, are you full-time physician? I said I'm a full-time in both. And if it's not 24 hours, it's 48 hours a day. Each one is a 24-hour profession. As you know, a rabbi receives phone calls at 12 midnight. A doctor also receives phone calls at that time. And I lived like that for decades, actually. I moved from, grew up professionally in medicine and in the rabbinate. And as most of you will probably know me more as the founder and the rabbi of the Safra synagogue and Safra community in the city, whereas the Edmond J. Safra synagogue. I founded the Moïse Safra Community Center and also the Sephardic Academy of Manhattan. And that's how I lived here in the States. Went back to Mexico only to visit the rest of my family, who still until today, they live there. Over 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I organized a Sephardic heritage trip to Spain, in which I took Rabbi Luxstein, one of our neighbor rabbis in the Upper East Side of KJ, and I took many of his congregants with me to Spain. They all wanted to discover the Sephardic heritage. And we traveled from city to city, learning about all the sages, the communities. In that trip, there was a gentleman who lives in Westchester, and we became very, very friendly. He was fascinated to know that I speak Arabic, that I know Arabic culture, that I'm knowledgeable of the Quran, and so on and so forth. And he told me that he does business with the Gulf region, with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, many of those countries. And he said, you need to meet the leadership of those countries because they will be fascinated by somebody like you. I said, anytime, my pleasure. So whenever either a government official or a member of society of that region will be in New York, he tried to make sure that we will meet. And we would meet just to speak, just to converse, nothing much, to exchange ideas, history, stories. And that's how he was for many years, until 2.5 years ago. This same gentleman was a dear friend of mine until today, of course, said, I would like to donate a Torah to the Sefer Torah, right? A Torah scroll to the small Jewish community in Dubai, but I want to do it in memory of Sheikh Zayed, may he rest in peace, the founding father of the United Arab Emirates, the father of the crown prince of today, and also of the president of the UAE. He says, I want to do it in his memory, and I want it to be a Sephardic Torah scroll, the standing ones with a beautiful case, because that is the culture, and I want them to feel the Jewish culture. I said, by all means. So I was able to procure a Sefer Torah for him. We traveled to the Dubai, and now that year actually is when the United Arab Emirates declared the Year of Tolerance. The 2019, they declared it the Year of Tolerance. It was during that year that they invited Pope Francis and Imam Tayyib from Al-Azhar University, considered the top imam in Sunni Muslim religion. They invited them to Abu Dhabi to sign what is known as the Human Fraternity Declaration. In a sense, the fraternity among the Abrahamic religions, and that all these religions are bona fide, and one ought to respect the other one, and we are close. In fact, we are all descendants of Abraham. So that was the Year of Tolerance, and that's the year in which I visited the UAE for the first time. And then eventually we returned less than a year later to to do the ceremony in Abu Dhabi itself, in the palace of the Crown Prince, His Highness Mohammed bin Zayed. And it was a fascinating meeting with him, speaking with him, reminiscing about actually Lebanon, as he told me that he used to summer there with his parents in the same city that I used to summer, Hamdoun. And we exchanged stories about the ice cream parlor or the movie theaters or the the children game, as we almost are of the same age. He might be just 3 to 4 years younger than I am. So we reminisced about that time. Of course, we spoke about philosophical Jewish issues and Islamic issues and so on and so forth. We created kind of a bond, of a relationship. We understood each other. And after that, I returned to the United States without any thought of returning back. It was just a goodwill visit, so to speak. It wasn't until after the signing of the Abraham Accord, in which now the community was requested by the government to register as a official representative of the Jewish people, as the official community. As you know, in history, Arab and Muslim countries recognize religions as independent, autonomous communities, in which they had autonomy in jurisprudence, in Batei Din, and kashrut, and any personal status and communal issues. Those communities had autonomy, and those communities were recognized officially by the governments. And so that's what they wanted to do there. They wanted to recognize the Jewish community as a official religion, official representative of the Jewish people, as an autonomous community of faith. So when the community came to register, they told them, for a community of faith to be recognized as such, they need a faith leader. They need a spiritual leader. Just a lay person who is representative is not enough. They need to have a religious leader. It is then that the community, in consultation with the officials there, recognize that maybe I should be the person, as they have already known me from before. We have made connections with them, and eventually they asked me. I thought about it, not for a long time, tell you the truth, and I took upon myself to do so. I felt it is a historic moment. I felt we were at the crossroads of history. I felt, who knows, maybe that's where I'm a man of faith. That's where God, Hashem, the Almighty, is sending me, and I need to step up to the challenge and fulfill it as best as I can. And so I took up my suitcase and I left, and I went to the United Arab Emirates. And from day one that I arrived, I have been received by the government and by society with open arms, with a smile, with a keen interest in learning more and more about Judaism, about Jews, about Israel. They have many people are learning Hebrew. They're learning Hebrew. Many people they want to know more about Judaism. There's now a museum, the Crossroad of Civilization Museum, that has made several ceremonies together with the Jewish community. The last one, an exhibit about the Shoah, and many more exhibits are coming to feature Jewish culture, especially Middle Eastern Jewish culture, Sephardic Jewish culture, as they feel that closeness. As I speak with them in Arabic, and we explain the sister religions, first of all, and the sister languages, Arabic and Hebrew, or Judaism and Islam, and they find that very, very fascinating. I feel very comfortable over there. I have not heard, seen, or experienced any anti-Semitic incident. In fact, I remember after 2 weeks that I was there, in my meeting with one of the ministers, I asked if I need a security detail, to protect me. I wasn't sure if that was necessary or not, but I felt, maybe I need one. Who knows? And he asked me, he says, did you have any incident? Anybody bothered you? Anybody gave you a bad look? I said, no, nothing at all. I feel comfortable. He said, if you want one, we will put you one. If that will make you feel more comfortable, we will give you one by all means. It would be a pleasure. He says, but let me assure you that you don't need one. In fact, from the moment you got off that plane, we have been protecting you. And so from that day on, I have to say, I stopped jaywalking. Because, I don't want to be receiving a call from the minister telling me, Rabbi, it's just not proper to jaywalk. So now I make sure I wait before I cross the street for the right green light of pedestrians to make it. And yes, indeed, the Jewish community is well protected. I feel well protected, well received. And the idea of the Council of Sephardic Sages, it is indeed that closing of that circle that I began speaking about, where we have seen, unfortunately, that Sephardic rabbinic philosophy has been waning, has been, if not forgotten, but has been pushed aside to if I may use that term, and please forgive me, it's not a derogatory term at all, the Ashkenazification of the rabbinate, in which that Sephardic tolerance or Sephardic open-mindedness in what's called the Pesach, the halachic decision or the halachic decision process, where many of our Sephardic sages of the past, and again, Maimonides is one of thousands, you know, he might be the representative. And let me take a parenthesis here and say that actually in my legacy trip to Spain, I visited a Casa Sefarad, a library in Spain. And that library, I saw in it a encyclopedia. What was that encyclopedia? That encyclopedia was about Rabbinos Escritores. What's the Rabbinos Escritores? Basically rabbis and scholars. And that was a 2-volume encyclopedia, which actually I just recently saw that it has been printed anew, and it is in Amazon, believe it or not. Rabbinos Escritores, where it features rabbis that have published in the rabbinate and scholars themselves that have published in whatever area of their profession. And we are talking about from the 10th century to 16th century. So that's 600 years of Sephardic contribution to the rabbinate and whatever other human endeavor, either science, cartography, astronomy, poetry, liturgy, whatever it is that human endeavor took place. That's where that sage was featured in that. So I estimated over 1,000 of them. So we're talking about a period of 600 years when you have 1,000 rabbis that have also a secular profession, and they're published in both. We're talking about over 1.4 or so, 1.4 of a sage per year. And there is no other period in history that can be the same. There's no other period in history that it is equal to that 600 years of over 1,000 sages in the rabbinate and in secular, published on both. You can't find that. And so that, you know, we need to go back in a sense to that period of time. We need to revive that entire era. It was published in 1781 by Dr. Jose Rodriguez de Castro, who was actually a converso. And the book is called, in Spanish, is called Biblioteca Española de los Escritores Rabinos Españoles. Again, it's from the 10th century to the 16th century. And so I believe very strong in that, to try to revive those times. I mean, nowadays, if you want to count, so many people have told me, well, there are plenty of Jews in science, and so much 25-26% of Nobel Prize winners are Jews. I say, yeah, that's wonderful. Of course, the Jewish people are very smart and great achievers, but how many of them Forget that they are rabbis. How many of them, they know anything about Judaism? How many of them, they practice Judaism? How many of them have published in Judaism? How many of them are rabbis? So if we take the last 400 years or 300 years from the Enlightenment until today, I think you don't have more than 15 people in a period of 400 years, no more than 15 people, where in a period of 600 years, you had over 1,000 of those sages. So I want to go back to those periods of times, and we want to try to revive. And what a best place to do so is back in the Middle East, back in an Arab country, where the commingling, especially in the UAE, as it was in the time of the Andalus in Spain, the commingling of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity produced such sages amongst the three religions, not just amongst Jews, of course, amongst the three religions, the discussions, the learning from one another, with due respect to each one's different religion and different faith, but this commingling of knowledge, of creating bridges. And so we had that feeling that it would be a historical moment to establish the Council of Sephardic Sages, especially in the UAE, and try to revive that period of time in history. Maybe I'll stop over here, so I'll give you time for questions and answers. And again, thank you very much.
I think you just gave great headway into Alan's a little bit loaded question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You can decide if you want to answer it. He wrote, why were Sephardi rabbis more lenient than Ashkenazi rabbis, many of whom, including the Brisker, Rav Soloveitchik, recognize the authority of the Rambam to this day? So I think you started to touch upon it, but you didn't exactly. And so.
Right. So I think this goes back to the approach that Sephardic rabbis and Ashkenazi rabbis took when they studied the Talmud. Sephardic rabbis, when they studied the Talmud, and it is brought especially by the Rif, which was a Sephardic scholar from Morocco first, then Spain, and vice versa, of the 11th century, 10th, 11th century. They studied the Talmud. They wanted to know the entire Talmud, what's known as Bekiut, knowledge, a thorough knowledge of it, so they could derive from it the proper halacha, the proper way of life. And when they decided that, as I said, as you see in Rif, and then as you see amongst Maimonides, that he really took the Talmud. In fact, in his introduction to his magnum opus, he writes, with my book, you're not going to need the Talmud anymore, because I have culled all the halakha, all the, the proper decisions of law in it. So you don't even have to go to the Talmud. So the purpose of Sephardic rabbis, and also of the time of the Geonim, and I would say of the time of the Talmudic rabbis, the entire purpose of the Talmudic rabbis' discussions was to derive what the halakha is, what the Jewish law should be or is. And before they make that decision, they took into consideration the environment, the people, the historical moment, so on and so forth, the geography. And they came up to the halakhic decision. So that's why Sephardic, I don't know if I wouldn't call it lenient, but I would call it more open-minded, if I may. They took into consideration that the knowledge of the Talmud is to derive Jewish law. And when we derive Jewish law, we're taking into consideration the place, the location, and the time. And that's when we derive Jewish law. And they came up with whatever decision it was within the parameters of what we called halacha. Ashkenazi rabbis, they were more interested in intellectual exercise of the Talmudic passages, and not necessarily to derive the law from it, but more of the intellectual interest. What about, what if, what when, and so on and so forth. And many of time when you get involved in an intellectual exercise, which is incredible, as the Brisk yeshiva, which Yeshiva University is kind of a descendant of that, when you get involved in so much like that, sometimes you lose the focus on the place, location, and time. And so therefore you come to a halakhic conclusion that it's strictly theoretical, and then go ahead and try to apply it to a practical situation. And you have sometimes difficulty. And that's why it might appears to be more strict, because you're dealing more with theoretical questions than practical ones. here is an example that actually it happened during my trip to the Sephardic legacy in Spain. And that is Rabbi Luxstein brought an issue, the difference between the Rif, Rabbi Yitzhak El-Fassi, and the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. Now, Rabbeinu Asher was an Ashkenazi rabbi who escaped to Spain, became the chief rabbi of the yeshiva in Toledo, who was placed and installed by the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, right? The Sephardic rabbi at that time, Sephardic sage. So Rabbi Rosh saw that many of his Talmidim were wearing the Arba'a Bekanfot, the inner garment tzitzit. It was the material was linen, and yet the tzitziot were made out of wool. And he completely disagreed, the Rosh. And then he found out that the Rif allowed that. Rosh was demanding from his students to change the entire tzitzit to completely wool, that the garment is wool, the tzitziot are wool. And then he realized that nobody was listening to him. And so Rabbi Luxstein at that time, he said, I don't understand, like it's obvious that wool, you cannot mix it. And why would the Rif give a psak that you could do it with a lighter type of a garment, which is linen? And that was the discrepancy between the Rosh and the Rif. And the Rif writes that, the Rosh writes that his Talmidim would not listen to him, could not stand with that decision. So I said, look, the Rosh comes from Northern Europe. It was very, very cold, right? And they most likely were able to use the wool garment. But the Rif comes from Morocco and from Spain, which was extremely, extremely hot. And he had to find a lenient position to say, no, you could use linen instead of wool garment. So people would use it. Otherwise, if he would demand from them to use wool, nobody would wear it because it was so hot that just humans will not be able to obey that law. In fact, our sages say that the same way it is a mitzvah to say something that people follow, it is also a mitzvah not to say something that people cannot follow. And not only that, there's a whole dictum that you cannot make a decree that the public cannot obey, cannot follow, because it's impossible. And so that, when I gave that explanation, that brought an entire completely different view of the situation, where Sephardic rabbis, as I said, they looked to see in what way we could make our community fulfill the halakha properly, and yet in a way that is tolerable and practical.
So I'm gonna encourage people, please, to open your cameras. You'll get a notice saying that you're allowed to open it. And while they're opening them, Lori asks, how do you balance the needs of traditional Sephardic Jews with the Ashkenazi population that also lives in the Gulf states?
So yes, so I'm a rabbi of all, and fortunately, as I said, I was educated at Yeshiva University. I was educated in the Sephardic department and in the Ashkenazi department, both. So when an Ashkenazi comes to ask me what the law is, I give them the Ashkenazi law. When a Sephardi comes to me and asks me about what the halacha is, and I give them the Sephardic halacha. So that's how I balance things. And in the tefillah at the beginning, as we had mixed Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews together because there was not enough to have a separate minyanim, we would say one melody in Ashkenazi nosach, one melody in Sephardic nosach, and that really created a beautiful sense of unity. And that's something that even when one may have plenty of people, maybe we won't change that because people really enjoy from both communities.
And I don't see Yonatan's camera open, but I'm going to ask you, what unique customs does the UAE Jewish community practice, which began with your arrival to the country?
Well, there are no really unique customs because the Jews there are no local indigenous Jews to the UAE or to the Gulf region. Of course, we know that there were Jewish communities in the Hijaz region of Saudi Arabia, even during the time of Muhammad and before. the advent of Islam. Of course they were. And in Bahrain, the community is 180 years old. They found a one tomb with Hebrew inscriptions in Ras Al Khaimah, which is the budding area of the UAE in the Gulf, but they didn't find any other one. And so it is believed that that tomb was not maybe of a Jewish community, but of a Jew that may have been passing by through his commercial travels to India, the Far East and back, that he may have died there and he was buried there. But there isn't an indigenous Jewish community to the UAE. Oman, likewise, there is actually a Jewish cemetery. They may have had a Jewish community, but nothing is left of those communities. So we have Jews from all corners of the world, from countries that start with an A and end with a Z, from Argentina to Zimbabwe, from Albania to Swaziland, and so each one has different customs, different opinions, different way of doing things. And my hard job is basically unite them, try to find a common denominator for all of them, and be able to create a Jewish community. So what's anything special? Well, I think we do say something special every Shabbat, and that is a blessing to the Malchut, right? Blessing prayer for the royal family, for the crown prince, and for the president, and for the entire country. That's the only thing special that I can say we do. Different than any other communities in the world, although many other communities also they praise their own government and their own royalty.
Jonathan, did that answer your question, or did you?
I was wondering about that blessing to the government. If it's in Arabic or in Hebrew.
Sometimes, depending, if we have Emiratis joining us, we say it in Arabic so they can understand. If not, we say it in English and part of it in Hebrew also.
Mabruk, shukran.
Shukran ilak.
Okay, Alan has a question. Alan, you want to open your microphone?
Shalom, Rabbi.
Hey, Alan, how are you? Again, good to see you.
Very good. Likewise. Just following on my previous question about the leniency, and I very much appreciate the example that you chose to illustrate the difference in terms of the Sephardim taking into consideration the geography, location, as opposed to the more intellectual interpretation, which brings me to a second question. And that is, could you summarize, and it might be very difficult to, how would I put it, contrast the learning of the Gemara by the Sephardim and that by the Ashkenazim that has changed over time. The brisker is pretty modern. And it just reminds me of one story. I went to a yeshiva that was very Litvish yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva went to Tunisia and discovered that they had a way on the Isle of Djerba of studying Gemara. And he, as a Litvak, basically the brisker method that we were taught at yeshiva, said he had never seen anything like that. That was way, way beyond what, as you know, the Ashkenazim consider the brisker to be, royalty. I'll stop there.
Well, yes, like I said, there is what's called ayun and there is what's called beki'ud. The ayun is you really have an intellectual exercise about a paragraph or a passage in the Talmud, and you try to see it back, forth, and roundabout, and within and without, and all the different possibilities of interpretation of that. Sometimes, when you go that far, you may, in a sense, leave if not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, and that probably what makes the difference between the methods of study. Look, the method of study of the Sephardim is a method that really is linked totally to the Talmudic rabbis, because from the moment of the destruction of the Second Temple, as the Jews spread throughout either Baghdad, Iraq, and then Egypt, North Africa, and some of them Southern Europe, there was always a complete connections between all those centers of Torah studies, all the way to Spain. Letters went from Spain all the way to Baghdad during the time of the Geonim, and then it reversed, went from Baghdad to Spain when the sages of Spain were already living there. And so there was a constant communication between, again, from Spain all the way to Baghdad and even to Iran. So everybody knew each other in that sense. Intellectually, their method of study, and so the Sephardim, in a sense, continued that tradition of study from the rabbis of the Talmud, from the Tanaim, the Emoraim, and then later on the Saboraim and the Geonim. So it was a continuum of style of study and of style of deciding halacha. The Jews in Europe, there was approximately 400 years of disconnect, I would say, from the 6th century to the 10th century. Suddenly, Jewish literature, rabbinic literature, starts appearing in Europe around the 10th century, 9th, 10th century. So there were several centuries of disconnect. And so that disconnect created a different style of study and a different interpretation of that study. Again, the difference is not unsurmountable. It definitely not. But that difference really, me'afyenet, as they say, qualifies and characterizes each community as a different community of study.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Dalia has a question.
Hi. My question is, I guess, less about Sephardi history and more about your personal history. I was wondering, when you made the move to the UAE, how your family, who has the history of being in the Arab world, how they felt for you to go back to the Arab world.
Well, of course, some of my families were concerned. Are you sure it's safe? Are you sure it's okay? Because of their past experience. But I assure them and reassure them that it's different, that we are kind of going to close that circle. We are going to, in a sense, rejuvenate or reinvent those old times in which there was tranquility, there was a commingling of those cultures, and in which we were able to live together, build bridges. And that's my intent. Am I naive? I hope not. I hope not. And so far, what I have seen in the last 8 months, I'm definitely not. Will it take a longer time to get not just the UAE, but other countries? Yes, it would take longer time, but I think eventually it will happen. People are tired of the old narrative. People want a new narrative. People want a brighter future. People want to cooperate in that region with Jews and with Israel. And it's happening. It is happening as we speak, and it will continue to happen. Eventually, I think that entire region will change. And that will create, again, a new a golden era, if you will, in that entire region and in the relationship between Jews and Arabs, or Judaism and Islam.
Professor Pereles?
Rabbi Abadie, thank you for this wonderful journey you took us on. I dovetailing on Dalia's question and your last comment, I have a mixture of a comment and a question, which is, first of all, could you explain a little bit more about this council? Where are these sages? Where are they functioning? If you know, to what extent is this going to be a network of Chachamim? And where do you see perils and promises, right, in this new endeavor? What are some of the real opportunities that you can see this flowering happening, and what are some of the dangers that you see Jewish communities needing to navigate in this endeavor, and for that matter, the Muslim communities needing to navigate and to make sure that this does come to a fruition, and continue that the kind of that opening you see in the UAE continue to happen in other parts of the wider Islamic world. Yeah.
So the seat will be in the UAE, but the sages will be from all over the world. All over the world, Sephardic rabbis and even Ashkenazi rabbis who in a sense subscribe to that view of life, to that process of halakha, to that Sephardic tradition in a sense, they're welcome to be part of it, members of it, and participate in all what we do. And so it will be an international kind of, I don't want to call it a professional organization, but it is somehow of a professional organization, but it's going to be an organization that it's more than just professional. It will be an educational, a cultural organization of rabbis that do continue and want to continue in that Sephardic age-old tradition and way of life, or way of looking at the halakha and at Jewish scriptures and the Talmud. Of course, that will, in the same as in those times of the golden era in which religious leaders were the bridge builders between the governments, between the monarchy, between the caliphs and other religions. So too, we will serve in that role, to be those bridge builders and connections to the authority and to other religious leaders, imams and cardinals, or whoever is there from the Christian religion, as I am already serving as such in that region. Now, what the difficulty is to convince, and not that I want to, but Sephardic rabbis who, because they have been educated in Ashkenazi yeshivot, or even their parents have been educated in Ashkenazi yeshivot, and only follow the Ashkenazi derech, right? Those might be a challenge, because they, what should I say? They don't know what it was. They only know what it is for them. They never experienced it. They were not born in those regions, or their parents were not born. We talked already about, when the Jews left the Middle East and North Africa in the 1950s, the latest, of course, there were a few families left after, but a bulk of those communities, we're talking about already now almost the third generation. And so those generations never experienced that life, never were exposed to such rabbinic decision, never learned in that system. And so it's very, very difficult to show them something different and for them to accept it. As we have seen in Israel, there are rabbinic organizations and international rabbinic organizations that are practically sponsored by a political party. And of course, the term Sephardi is there and it's prominent there. But I think that term does not reflect the true essence of those organizations. It's just, I think, a name of origin, or a name of an Aida. Where do I come from? But it does not reflect the practical aspect of Sephardic Judaism. It mostly is a term of identification. And that is, I think, a major situation in which we have to deal with. We have to be able, how we could communicate. We have to be able to see how we can really all be part of it in a sense. But those are the challenges that I think we will face.
If you have questions, please either just wave or put them into the chat. I do want to say that one of your colleagues, Rabbi Abadie, Rabbi Abadie, is sending out Chazak u'Baruch to my very good friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Abadie, and you make us all proud. So I thought that was important to add there.
Thank you, Rabbi Abadie. Pleasure to hear from you. As always, a very dear old friend of mine for many years.
And Rabbi, Professor Perez, did you have something else?
I have many questions, but I'm sure other people in the audience do. So I want to give it over to them.
Oh, okay. Well, if you have another question, we'll continue. If not, we will.
What is the common language of the community?
The common language is English, believe it or not. The UAE has nationals from over 200 countries, even though there are only 94 countries in the United Nations, but they claim to have over 202 countries nationals. So you have a salad of languages from Urdu to Spanish to English to Pashtun, all Chinese, Indian, Hindu, all the languages. And so the only common lingua franca is English. And so almost everybody there speaks English, including the Emiratis. Government ministries, they have it's a dual language, Arabic and English. Signs in the streets are Arabic and English. So I know some people in the community that don't speak a word in Arabic, and they have been living there for 30 years. I don't condone such behavior. I think they should learn Arabic just for the respect of the country and to enrich their lives. But you can get by or get away with just English there.
Rabbi Abadie, question about Israel. Throughout when you meet Muslims throughout the world, you often find that you can talk about many shared features of our cultures, of our histories, of our religions, and then often you get to Israel and it becomes a very sensitive matter and a difficult one to bridge, even when there is warm, positive relationships on many other fields. How does that play out in the Emirates? How do you see that? I mean, it's hard to know. How do you see that changing now?
Well, I definitely tell you that many Emiratis have spoken about Israel very frankly and very warmly. Many of them feel that they have been gypped, so to speak, by the old narrative, by saying, we were really robbed of 73 years of the ability to learn the truth, to know the real story, to be able to be friendly with our neighbor, a strong country, to benefit from mutual interests. So many of them have expressed that to me. During the war in Gaza last month or so, I received many private messages of support from the people in the region, and not just from the UAE, from many other Arab countries that I have been in touch with, or they have been in touch with me, really text messages of support. And some of them, in fact, even tweeted those messages of support, positive. Of course, are they still others that I have not received any message of hatred privately, but of course, publicly they are from people that I don't know personally. So, of course, somebody, one of the reporters of Reuters asked me a few Shabbatot ago that we had a Shabbaton and we invited them. They said, I know you have not felt any anti-Semitic incident, and there's definitely nothing publicly, even in the official press of the UAE, there was no criticism of Israel in a sense. There was support, diplomatic support, of course. But I live with the people, and I do sense there is some undertones of if not anti-Semitism, but anti-Israel. What do you have to say about that? I said, and my answer to her was, look, there are 10 million people living in the UAE. I cannot expect that 10 million people are going to love me or going to love Israel. There's going to be difference of opinion, and that's what makes us different. And that's, God did not meant for all of us to have the exact opinion, the exact thought process. Otherwise, we will be automatons and robots. God created a beautiful world with different opinions, with different ideas. I said, like the Talmud says, the same way that we all look different, each one of us, our opinions are also different. That's okay to have a difference of opinion, and that's okay to disagree with Israel and not to like the Jews. I said, what is not okay, I said, is to express that publicly with hatred and inciting to violence. That is not okay. You can have your opinion, and I respect that. We disagree on that. That's okay. But to go out into the street, spew hatred, violence, and incite to violence against the Jews and Israel, that is not okay. And I said, and that is where the Western world has failed to stop that. Nobody is telling people you cannot have that opinion or that idea. You could, but that doesn't give you the right to come to the street, spew hatred, and incite acts of violence against the Jews and Israel. And unfortunately, the West has failed on that, because under the rubric or the false rubric of freedom of expression, they have allowed violence, incitement to violence, hatred, in the public sphere, in the streets, violence against Jews, Israeli, establishment and Jewish establishment that may have nothing to do with Israel. And so that's where I told her the West failed, where the UAE has stood its ground and respected that. You could have any opinion you want, but you have no right to go into the street and incite violence and manifest and speak against and do acts of violence against any group. They tell the story of Sheikh Zayed, may he rest in peace. As you know, there are a lot of Indians and Pakistanis in the UAE. They all work very hard to make a living, to support their families. When they started coming over 30 years ago, as you know, Pakistan and India are not the best of friends. And so they started to have these attacks in the streets and animosity. Sheikh Zayed gathered the leadership of both, and he told them, in this country, you have to respect each other. You want to fight, you go back to your countries and fight there. Here, you are not allowed to fight. You could have any opinion you want, but you cannot take that opinion to the street and fight each other. You want to live in peace, then you are welcome to stay. You don't want to live in peace, then I'll make sure you don't stay here. And that's the philosophy of the country, and that's the philosophy in which the country was founded, of tolerance, of coexistence, of respect, mutual respect for each other, ethnicities, religion, whatever it is. You could have your opinion that you want, but you're not allowed to express that hatred and incite to violence publicly.
As we begin to wrap up, looking forward, where are the next places in the Islamic world that you see these sort of openings beginning? Perhaps not as open as the UAE. That's been, as anyone who's followed the story knows, this didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen a year ago. This is years and years of Jews quietly coming, making connections, and the UAE itself developing this culture of tolerance. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's a mutual, it's an enlightened self-interest, and it's something that core values that they've developed. So what other places do you see someone asked about the possibility of Lebanon becoming a Jewish place again. But let's, what in your assessment, living there, being closer on the ground, seeing people, because Dubai, as everyone knows, the UAE, as everyone knows, is a real crossroads for the entire Middle East, and not the entire world. So what do you see as some of the options? And I do see now that we have a few more questions, so that'll be great. But please,
so of course, we see it happening in Bahrain, very, very open. We are going to see it happening in Saudi Arabia, I believe. As Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, said last year or even 2 years ago, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And it is going to happen, and I believe it will happen sooner than later. It might happen even in Pakistan, as I read of a report, believe it or not to have a Jewish community, but to have a diplomatic relations with Israel. As I read a report just a few days ago that Saudi Arabia is actually pressing Pakistan to make an overture to Israel and establish diplomatic relations with a lot of incentives given from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. Could it happen in Kuwait eventually? Could it happen in Syria? In Syria probably will happen before that it could happen in Lebanon, believe it or not. Lebanon would be the ideal place because it was the Switzerland of the Middle East, Beirut, the Paris of the Middle East. The major problem in Lebanon is what to do with Hezbollah. Other than that, I think Lebanon is ripe for a peace treaty with Israel and for welcoming the Jewish community back. But there is a major obstacle, and that had to be dealt with. And we leave it to the wisdom of political leaders and world leaders to come up with that solution.
Ariel, you want to? Oh, sorry.
No, please, Dora.
Ariel, you want to open your microphone?
Shalom, Rabbi, and this esteemed guest. Thank you so much for doing this and having us on the line and being so intricate and explaining everything that's going on. I'm calling from Los Angeles, California, part of the large Persian Jewish community that we have here. We're very supportive of what you guys have done and what you're going to continue to do, God willing. I'm a child of immigrants. My parents came here prior to the revolution from Iran, and we have always had a yearning to go to these areas, especially, I mean, now that the UAE is so open, it's right across the sea. You could literally see Iran from the UAE. And, there is so many positive things happening now and so many positive moves happening throughout the Middle East. What are your prospects on, you think, all of these peace treaties coming together, putting any pressure on this, tyrannical regime that they have going on there, maybe to turn the tide, to do something positive for us to maybe go see our ancestral land of 2,500 years?
Well, look, we all wish and pray that Iran changed its way. That rhymed, actually, but unfortunately, I don't see it, because the more years pass, the more intransigent Iran becomes. With the election of this new president, which is considered by many people in the world as even more radical than the previous president, with his declarations of the past, with his actions of the past, it shows where Iran is going. In fact, it is believed that he might even take the place of Khatami when Khatami leaves his post naturally or unnaturally. But, and so the change in Iran can only be made internally. If the population of Iran is unhappy, they have to do something. And that's probably the only way. No nation in the world has any appetite for war against Iran, and they know it will be a bloody war. No nation has that appetite. Nobody in the region has that appetite. The countries in the region, from what I know, of course, they want to contain Iran. They want a change of regime, or at least a change of policy. But they're not expecting that to happen anytime soon, unless the people from inside make that change. And I think there was an opportunity during the Obama administration, and my own humble opinion, unfortunately, that Obama missed that opportunity to do something, and now it's kind of went back dormant. So yeah, it would be wonderful to see Iran go back to the days of old, in which they welcomed the Jews and welcomed many other ethnic groups, and living all peaceful next to each other. But unfortunately, I don't see that happen anytime soon. No outside force will do it. Only inside they can do that. And there has to be a major outcry by the population in Iran to make that change.
Also, Rabbi, are you guys eventually, hopefully, going to be having some, I'm part of a lot of young professionals here out in Los Angeles. We would love to, come to the UAE, come see the community experience. I mean, all Middle Easterners would love to experience that. Are you guys going to ramp things up like that for us to be able to get a group together or something, so we can come and check you guys out?
Of course. We already have over 20 to 30 groups planning to come after the high holidays around October and November, from all over the world. Of course, the majority of them from the United States. I mean, even this past year, December and January, we had over 100,000 Jewish tourists, amazing. Most of them Israelis. And so, yes, we are waiting. Of course, the COVID restrictions have limited those, but as I say, even with all of that, we had over 100,000 Israeli tourists. So, yes, you make your group, you let us know when you come. Let me tell you, the best time to travel to the UAE, to that entire region, is from October to May. They have a beautiful weather, blue skies, outdoor everything. And it's beautiful. From June to September is quite hot, very, very hot.
That's it. Can you imagine?
If you want a vacation, that's not the place to go.
Of course. I look forward to meeting you, God willing. Bezrat Hashem.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Abadie. and Professor Parelis and Jason and everyone else who's here. I'm not going to start because I will not be able to recognize everyone, but this can't be the end. We are ending for today, but we will have to continue this conversation because there's so much here, more here to unpack, and also definitely more for us to continue working together on. So thank you very, very much. Thank you all for joining.
And mañana en español, tell all your Spanish speakers, friends, and loved ones that they can experience this in its own way. It's a trend. You know, when you translate something, it's transformed. It's a bria chadasha. It's a new thing, and we look forward to that tomorrow. So please,
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Professor Parelis. Thank you, Drora. Thank you, Jason, and thank you all, dear friend and attendees. I will take the opportunity to welcome you when you come to the UAE with the words Ahlan wa Sahlan.
Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Shukran.